Welcome. My name is 𝗍𝗶𝗹, Managing Principal and co-founder of 𝗂𝗎 Search Advisors, a national executive search firm focused on the real estate industry. Today, I am thrilled, as part of the Women in Real Estate series, to have Amy Castleberry, Managing Director, Senior Living Finance of Ziegler, joining us. Amy, thank you so much for being part of Wires today.
Absolutely. Thanks, Amy. Thrilled to be here.
Well, to start out, will you share a little bit about Ziegler and your role as the Managing Director of Senior Living Finance?
Yep, absolutely. So I started with Ziegler in 2006. Ziegler is a 120-year-old financial services firm. We do investment banking, and that focuses on both for-profit and not-for-profit senior living. We have a robust capital markets group that helps place bonds that we source for the not-for-profit side. And then we have a newer proprietary investment side, and that's where our Ziegler Linkage Fund and Aging Services Technology Group is. We've had a not-for-profit focus since about 1913. We actually started financing churches and still today finance churches, charter schools, hospitals, and then not-for-profit senior living in that not-for-profit group. And then our for-profit team, so that's the Seniors Housing Services and Care, they do a lot of for-profit M&A work and corporate finance services. We've really grown that arm over the last 15 years or so, but have a deep not-for-profit history, and that's the group that I serve in.
Okay. All right. Now, when we first met, you were at Legg Mason in the Municipal Finance Group for Seniors Housing and Healthcare. And then I remember in 2006 when you joined Ziegler, really focusing on the not-for-profit providers, as you said. So what drew you to the sector at Legg, and what do you love about senior living?
Yeah, it's so interesting. I was at a board meeting the other day, and we were talking about just attracting staff to the industry as a whole. And I sort of joked around to the board members, who here grew up wanting to be in senior living? It's just not something that's really on anyone's radar. So I think, like a lot of people, I fell into the sector. I was hired at Legg Mason straight out of business school at the University of Maryland. And of course, this was, 1999, 2000. So I was certain I was going to be an equity analyst. Well, we had the, equity market crash. So when I graduated, who was hiring? Legg Mason Fixed Income. Thrilled to get, any job at all at that time, frankly. And really started out as a fixed income generalist. We had a very large fixed income trading desk at Legg Mason. It was a lot of fun, 100 people. And I had exposure to, treasury bonds, corporate bonds, municipal bonds, even CMOs and all of the things that got everyone in a lot of trouble in 2008, exposure there. But Legg Mason, because of our robust wealth management network, both senior managed and served as co-manager to Ziegler on a lot of Maryland financing. So we had a public finance group at Legg Mason, and that's where the work was. That's where the need was. So I sort of went from a generalist more to a specific municipal bond analyst, and then even more specifically doing, CCRCs, not-for-profit senior living.
Okay. And then, the not-for-profit senior living world has changed quite a bit since you started. So what are some of the biggest changes that you've seen thus far? And what are some of the biggest opportunities that you see going forward?
Yeah, absolutely. Some of the biggest changes, I think, is the increased sophistication of not-for-profit organizations. Some of that has to do with the affiliation activity that's happening. Years ago, I heard from John Spooner at Greystone. He was doing a presentation, and there was a survey where consumers found not-for-profit senior living organizations as compassionate, and they found for-profit senior living organizations as competent.
Okay.
And so I like to think now, redoing that survey, consumers would see not-for-profit senior living as both. I think we've really seen an increase in sophistication along all areas of the operation and marketing and technology and finance. I think the other big change is, and this comes along with the sophistication piece, I feel organizations are more outward looking. We see that with conferences that providers attend. I think a lot of that is driven by what's happening with technology and the eagerness to really get ahead of the technology and understand how technology is impacting other sectors and how organizations maybe can use that to their benefit. I think the third difference is, and this gets more into the real estate side, the availability of land and the difficulty sourcing land. Years ago, it was not uncommon for a new campus to be built on land that was donated or part of a church or, received at very favorable terms. And that is just not happening anymore. So organizations need to be more sophisticated in their land sourcing. Now, I think there are a lot of opportunities with that. There are opportunities around, redevelopment, whether that's, former elementary education sites that are being redeveloped, religious institutions that are being redeveloped, especially here where I am focused on the East Coast. I serve clients in DC, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. So it can be a little bit different in the West and the South, where land is still relatively easy to develop. And compared with the East Coast, still somewhat inexpensive. But the whole sourcing land for any sort of growth and the capital required to do that, and the pre-development capital certainly has changed, but is also part of the opportunity, along with just the growing demographics. We sort of sound like a broken record, but with 12 million seniors 75 and up expected over the next 10 years, that wave is here. And, I think all of the seniors housing and care industry has an opportunity to serve these folks.
Well, compassionate and competent, and definitely cool. That's a great, great.
Yeah, that, I mean, that was,
Hopefully, they're both there. I think they've gotten there.
that was probably 15 years ago, and that quote has stuck with me.
It's interesting how things are so memorable. And that's a great quote to kind of think back on. So now, again, being in the investment banking world, and I'm sure and moving portrayals have not helped, but when you think about an investment banking, you think work-life balance is not something that comes to mind. You think grueling hours, cutthroat, so looking at Ziegler, however, Ziegler's had the longest tenure of employees that I have seen at any company. And being in recruiting, I do look at companies and tenure and things like that. And, they have 18, 20, 25, 30. I mean, Dan Herman has been there at 32, 30 some year. I mean, I can't even remember exactly, but what is it about Ziegler's culture that makes it such a great place, such a special place to work? And what has kind of kept you there?
Yeah. And I think it really is two things. It's the culture of Ziegler employees, certainly, and the firm. But then I think it's also the culture of our clients. You mentioned work-life balance. So I have a daughter who is 17 and a son who's 15. So, I've been at Ziegler, since before they were born. So I've certainly sort of had all of the ups and downs with that. I can recall a time back in 2012 when my kids were, very young, and I said to Dan Herman, my boss, I can't do this. I can't have, two kids under 3 and continue to perform the way I want to perform. And he said, no, like, let's think about this. Maybe you don't have to retire fully. Let's, work for something part-time. And so I was able to really bridge those years and then, come back full time. And I'm, absolutely convinced that if he hadn't have done that, if the firm didn't have that culture, that I would not have gotten back in. So I think that is, absolutely a key component. And I think we've seen that, and especially through the pandemic, work-life balance is no longer just a woman's issue.
Right.
Getting some of the younger generation of men, the associates and vice presidents that we have in our firm, uh, you know, do have more outside interests, are available to, if they need to, help with, their kids, and in some cases be primary caregivers for their children as well. So I think all of that is changing. I think work-life balance, there are times when you have to put your workforce first because that's what your work is demanding.
Right.
There are times when you have to put your kids first because that's what your kids are demanding. Years ago, I don't know if you remember, but Leading Age and the big not-for-profit senior living conference
Yep.
would have their big conference on Halloween every year. It was like for 5 years when my kids were young.
Yeah.
And, part of me obviously was, oh, I hate to miss Halloween with the kids. Oh, but then the other part was, this is a great opportunity for, their dad to take them around and do Halloween. And I'm so grateful that they got to, spend that time with him doing Halloween where, otherwise I might have just taken over.
Right.
I think the second piece that I mentioned is the culture of our clients. Many of the not-for-profit organizations are community-based. Often they are religious-based. And there is something, I think, about mission-driven organizations and people who have, broader objectives than a for-profit motive. When we go to board meetings, often we start with a prayer or a blessing or even a moment of silence just to center everyone, to say, there's a lot going on in the world, in our worlds.
Right.
Let's take, 30 seconds to pause, focus, and, really get to the work at hand over the next hour or two. That makes a big difference.
That's cool. That's very neat. It is, I love what you said about, Ziegler taking that time to kind of recognize where you were in your life. And that's really important for companies to see. And you're right, it has come forward more with COVID, companies recognizing, the different seasons of life, right? That the employees are going through, and what's happening now isn't going to be permanent. So let's work with you at this point and where you are. And then in a couple of years, and it really does cause employees to be incredibly loyal and thankful because people are willing to work with them. Employers are willing to work with them and say, hey, this is where you are. I get it. Let's see what we can make work right now. And then in a couple of years, or a couple of months or a couple of weeks, when you pass through this stage, we'll reevaluate.
Yep. And with some of the staffing challenges that not-for-profit organizations are having, we ask them what are they doing to improve retention, and one of them is a focus on employee culture and meeting employee needs. Yes, there is a salary aspect to it, but we are seeing more focus on developing and building employee-focused, employee-only spaces that are somewhere that they can call their kids' school or schedule a doctor's appointment, and for help when those life admin tasks relate into the day, especially if you're an hourly employee or a shift employee, you still need those breaks also.
Right.
And one of the thing operators are finding is, giving employees that flexibility during the day goes a long way for, retention and loyalty.
Or even take a moment to just pause, like you said, reflect, catch your breath. Because serving people is, again, in a mission-oriented culture, is so important, but its self-care is also important because helping people does take a lot out of people. So it's important to have that moment. That's what's wonderful. That's wonderful to hear. So, well, So three questions, and I'm going to take these one at a time. But what is your biggest accomplishment? What makes you the most proud?
So I'll tell you, still one of the things that makes me most proud is, early on in my career when I started with Ziegler, I wasn't a relationship manager, so sort of didn't lead my own deals, didn't have my own clients. Instead, I was hired to work on all the new campuses and major repositionings across the country, have some consistency around feasibility studies and covenants and things because we were doing, you know, 10 to 12 new campuses a year. As I transitioned my first year into a really revenue responsible relationship manager, I remember being at one of the Ziegler Awards and someone had won the Deal of the Year award. And I turned to Dan and said, I want to win the Deal of the Year award. And he looked at me and said, well, Amy, you have to get a deal done first. And the next year, I worked on a, 200 million, which at the time was a lot of money.
Yes.
Multi-state, multi-issuer financing. And actually that next year won the Deal of the Year award.
Congratulations.
So blind him that I told him that I was going to win it. I think sort of beyond that, for financing, oftentimes we're sort of the last piece of the puzzle to any development project or acquisition project. What's the rate? What's the cost of capital? There are times when our creative financing can really make a sort of straight line difference in the lives of residents. And I think that most often happens with affiliation financings or acquisition financings. When there is a community that is challenged, there are residents that are, nervous and concerned, and volunteer, board members that are nervous and concerned. And when we're able to, work with a sponsoring organization to come in, bring some stability and oftentimes creatively refinance that debt we've cut the interest rate at times by, 2/3 in some of these financings. And that, that lower cost of interest can mean, millions of dollars to an operating budget. And just the relief for residents and boards with that affiliation or acquisition are some of the most meaningful transactions.
Okay. What have you found the most challenging in your career?
I think that I still cannot control the market. It baffles me that and have like a week before a pricing, we know where rates are going to be, and we absolutely believe that, we will get the best available rate, in that market on that day. But in that week leading up to pricing, I'm watching the market every second and saying, please let's not have something come out of nowhere that, jack rates up 10, 15, 25 basis points. It's still challenging that I still can't control the market, and that still keeps me up at night on days before pricings.
And how have you surprised yourself the most in your career?
I think it is how skills change and required skills change as you grow in your career, especially for a person in finance. If you start out, in finance or in accounting, you are working with numbers and you have your head down and it's very analytical, and sometimes it's a very introverted position, drawing introverted people.
Yeah.
And you have control over what you're reviewing. And then, years go by and now it's more of a focus on people skills and dealing with uncertainty, doing public speaking maybe at a moment's notice, having iterations of models changing and having to be able to describe those again with very little warning. And then working with people, your vice presidents, associates, analysts, to get them up to speed and make sure that they're performing it at their best and feeling valued. So I think those are things that when you start out in finance or accounting, you don't necessarily think you're going to be called on to use those skills, 15, 20 years down the road. It's a much different job. I think, than when I started.
That moment you realize, oh my gosh, I am a subject matter expert. How to say it?
Funny, yeah. I actually had that as I was thinking about this question. It is, at some point, you are the expert in the room. No doubt.
So, are there any industry publications, blogs, podcasts that you follow regularly?
So, certainly the Wall Street Journal, absolutely the bond buyer. Those are on the, muni finance side. Seniors Housing News, of course, is something that we look at every day. And then really, all of the area business journals, especially for what's happening in real estate. The Baltimore Business Journal, the Central Pennsylvania Business Journal. They're, in my mind, although they are expensive, in my mind, there is no better source for, what is happening at the local level.
Okay. No, that's great. That's a great tip for folks. So what do you do in your free time?
Well, these days, because I have a 17-year-old, in my free time, I seem to be applying for colleges. But I am, trying to spend as much time with my kids as possible, knowing, again, so I have a daughter who's a senior, a son who is a sophomore. So I see the time I have with them at home being limited. They're also at the point where, my daughter is driving and they can take care of their own daily needs pretty well. They can dress themselves well for the most part. So it starts to be a real pleasure to just talk with your children as people. One of the things that I like to do is, in the evenings, I'm just in the family room, no phone, no TV on, maybe a book. And I find that if I am just there and available, then they will come and then they will sit and talk. Now, that's not every night because I do travel, and I'm out of the house, at least one night a week, sometimes more if there are conferences. But, on the nights that I'm there, that's really what I choose to do. I mean, other than that, running, travel when I can for sure. But it's getting to know my kids now that they are almost full-grown people. It's a great joy.
So last but certainly not least, what advice would you have for women or really anyone going into a real estate career?
Yeah, I think, for anyone starting out, there still has to be a period of, having your head down, working hard, learning to anticipate what your boss needs, what your client needs, really sharpening your skills and knowledge of the industry. I also encourage women, just to reach out more and, try and network more and, don't be bashful about asking people for help with the caveat that you have to have a connection. I receive notices on LinkedIn, I'm sure you do, from people, in undergrad or business school who want to talk to me about Ziegler or want to talk to me about my career. I can tell you, I've never received it from a girl, from a woman, from a girl. It's always young men who reach out to me. The ones that I respond to, so I would encourage young women to do that.
Right.
Because they don't seem to be doing it, at least not to me. And I do think that's important because I do think it helps, especially when, if resumes are going through AI, you do still need connections.
Right. Right.
But I think in reaching out, you need to make sure to have some connection with that person.
Right.
If I receive something from someone who, isn't in an area where I live, doesn't have any experience, or you didn't go to maybe the college that I went to.
Right.
Unless there's a real compelling reason, it's going to be hard. So whatever that connection may be, and I think you can always find one, make sure to make that connection, and then the person would be more likely to help.
We tell kids we do an interviewing and networking session for students. We've started doing that's really fun. And one of the things we say is it could be sports teams. You share a sports team in common, or you play the same sport, or you were in the same club, a chess club. You just look back through people's resumes, their profiles, articles, and see where you can make that connection. You might even be between somebody you know that you didn't realize that you knew, or they worked at either the local crab house down the street. We're in Maryland, you and I sit right now, and you didn't realize, oh my gosh, they worked here too. It can be the like you said, you can always find that connection, and if you reach out with that connectivity, people are much more likely to respond. So it's a great
Yeah.
piece of it.
And reach out, and for young women, reach out to women, reach out to men too.
Yes.
You're limiting yourself if you build a woman-only network. I think some of my, best mentors have been men.
Right.
So you need to be, open as long as you can make that connection to reaching out to men and women.
Absolutely. So, well, Amy, thank you so much for sharing your time this morning. It is always a pleasure catching up with you.
It's been a pleasure.
Pleasure working with you in the past on schools, and always wonderful to get your perspective. And to everyone who is watching this interview, we hope that you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for joining us today. And we will see you on the next episode of Wires. Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Thanks, Amy.